Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Matt Bichelle, Director of Product and Corporate Marketing. Today our main presenter is Mr. Mark Harris, Vice President of Marketing and Data Center Strategy here at Enlight Software. Mark joined Enlight Software from ServerTech, a data center power equipment manufacturer, where he was also Vice President of Marketing. Before that, he directed all sales and marketing for DCIM software at Raritan. And Mark also spent 7 years at Avocent and Cyclades, which are now part of Emerson, where he helped create their initial DCIM offering. If you haven't read Mark's blogs at enlight.com, you can do so at DCIMexpert.com, where he's owned that blog for some time, as well as several publications that Mark has contributed to. And I also believe that Mark has partially written the book on DCIM and a publication from Wiley and Sons. So with that, I give you over to Mark. Mark, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. And I appreciate everybody joining us today. You know, when we were thinking about putting some sort of an informational webinar together, we actually looked at, you know, many of us have been in this business for a very, very long time. It's been one of the up-and-coming technologies for years, literally years at this point. And yes, you know, in the process of writing DCIM for Dummies and New Data Center Handbook, I realized that there's just so much confusion and information that is hard to digest when it's presented out of context. So we got together inside and said, let's just take some of the more common either misunderstandings, we call them myths, and talk a little bit about them to help hopefully get the people on this call familiar enough with some of the realities, or at least have some sense for what to do next when you're faced with information that feels like it's a little hard to reconcile with what your experience tells you. You know, many of the people that have been in IT at this point have been there for many, many years. I think the U.S. Labor Department says that the average age of an IT professional today is about 46, which means many of us have been in IT for 20-plus years. And we've grown up where data centers were everything, where keeping systems up and running was your primary function in life. And only in the last years have sort of the tables been turned. And you know, I always tell people that at this point, our main job as IT professionals is not about keeping things up and running, but it's about keeping things up and running at the right price. And I think price and cost and all the economics and delivery and expectations, I think that back-end process is one of the major things that's changed. Obviously, there's lots of technologies that have changed. Servers and switches and the cooling and power distribution and the price of power. I mean, lots of things have changed, but what's happening with IT in general is we're being asked to become much more responsive to the business, much more accountable to the business. And so as we go through the next dozen slides or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, things that we've heard, things that seem to resonate and have no answers in the general population. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Matt. Yeah, and we'll go through, you know, as we go through this webinar, you know, one of our outcomes is help discuss several common myths about data center management and give you a little bit of the background, why you would hear that, whether it's, you know, true or half true, or what the reality is associated with it. You know, everybody on this call hopefully is trying to figure out when and where and how to jump into the DCIM pool. DCIM has been viewed by every major analyst as an up-and-coming technology, and with the introduction of things like Magic Quadrants and full coverage within all of the analyst communities, it's becoming part of an essential bag of tricks to manage the forward-looking data centers of the world. So we're going to go talk and identify some of the common myths and give you a little bit of reality behind them, because you are going to be going through the process of deploying DCIM in some point in your career. It's a matter of when you do that and at what, you know, what portions of your IT structure are you going to be applying DCIM to. We're also going to talk a little bit about the opportunity for forward-looking thinkers to address their challenges. And by that I mean, as I mentioned, many of us have been in IT for 20 plus years. We've grown up on ways of doing things. The industry is asking us to take a fresh look at what it takes to manage IT at the right price. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what can be done towards that goal using DCIM as the mechanism to get there. And then finally, at the very end, we'll talk a little bit about wrapping up. How do you resolve conflicting information? Who do you talk to? Where should you go for help? So let's just jump right in with myth number one, and I'll be keeping an eye on the questions and routing them through Matt and Margie, and at the very end we'll go through some of the questions that come up. Myth number one, DCIM is really about power management, and I see this all the time. I see many organizations that come to the DCIM category, and over the course of either an RFP or ongoing discussions, what you realize is that it becomes a discussion about power monitoring, and pulling power into a much more managed resource. The reality is that power management is eclipsed by asset and change management. Although we all look for low-hanging fruit and the pieces that can be done quickly and easily, which power management certainly fits in that category. I always tell people that DCIM is very analogous to the word automotive, and by that I mean DCIM doesn't have any subcategory descriptive. By saying that you want to get involved with DCIM, it's like saying that you want to purchase a product in the automotive category. In the automotive category, you would have things like tires and engines and stereos and sheet metal and all kinds of products. So by gross example, you would see companies like Goodyear and Alpine happily working in the same marketplace and not even competing. They literally are complementary. So when I look at power management, it is a valid piece of DCIM, but DCIM is actually so much more, and it includes asset management and change management as some of the biggest impacts in your fiscal opportunity to deliver IT services. In general, newer assets have reduced power, space, and management. So you can do more work with less power in smaller space, because every server, switch, everything in the data center is getting more dense, and just being able to deliver more IT, more processing at a lower budget. Power and cooling savings are coming about. Everybody's looking at new innovative ways, whether it's containment or whether it's free air cooling. So there are savings on that front, don't get me wrong, but there's also associated changes with things like depreciation and maintenance. And a lot of people in IT just never really subscribe to this part of the equation. And I'm guilty of the same thing. I've been in IT for 30 years, and when you talk about an asset coming onto the data center floor, you actually never realize things like depreciation and capitalization, the cost of warranty, and all of those back-end costs that are very real, by the way. As you go through your budgeting on a forward-looking data center, you'll realize that there's a tremendous amount of cost with keeping equipment past its 4th or 5th year. And so when you roll it all up together, you realize that the change processes, if optimized and adhered to, helps prevent not only old equipment remaining in place too long, but things like zombies or ghost servers. So by that, what I mean is that although you could look at DCIM and say, well, it must start with power management, and by going off and trying to find zombies and servers that are no longer needed, that's going to save me a bunch of power. Well, if you subscribe to this highly disciplined change management process, what you'll end up doing is realize that your design for the data center no longer includes a server. All business services have been removed from it in your design, and so by definition, there should be some sort of a workflow that removes it from the production floor. So rather than trying to find, get some sort of a meter and or view of each server and try to figure out is it doing any work, is it doing any meaningful work, a well-run data center with optimal processes actually knows by design whether a server should be there or not. Projects have been removed, the server is no longer needed, the design shows you that, So a work order would be generated to remove that from service. And then lastly, DCIM came about approximately the same time that the price of power was skyrocketing. 2007, thereabouts, topic number one was the skyrocketing price of power. John Coomey over at Stanford did a report for the EPA, and he talked about the price of power for data center usage in specific, and basically everybody's eyes opened up. Things like the green grid were formed, things like PUE became the hottest topic on the market, and at the time we thought power was going to go through the roof, and so everything was tied to power. Even DCIM, in other words, came out at the same time, and so that's, I believe, how power and DCIM became so strongly aligned. The reality is that today the price of power is stable. In some cases it's decreasing. I was in Las Vegas a couple of days ago and talked to a customer on the East Coast that's paying 2.9 cents per kilowatt, and I talked to another one up in the Dakotas that's paying a little over 4 cents a kilowatt. And that's long-term contracts. They didn't have to do anything magical. It's just the price of power. So the urgency is mitigated to go off and fix power because power has stabilized. It's only a small portion of the DCIM picture, and frankly, it's not even the largest portion of the picture. The depreciation, the cost of extra warranties, and longer-term capitalization on your books, those far outshadow saving a few kilowatts because the price of power is stabilized and decreased. Let's go on to number two. We also hear this throughout the industry, and we've heard it for years. Gartner would tell you that there's 60,000 large enterprises and organizations that should use DCIM. Of that, most people estimate between 5 and 10% of that marketplace is using some sort of a comprehensive DCIM. What that means is that 90% of the market thinks that their existing processes work fine as they are. Again, we've grown up on IT. We've done it for many, many years. We know how to put a server onto the floor. We know how to take one off. We know how to keep things running. We can run down in the middle of the night and get our screwdrivers out and keep production up and going. The reality is that business conditions today now dictate that new processes need to be used. Again, this is that cost element that's been introduced. Keeping things running at any cost is no longer the mantra. As a matter of fact, most applications now have been decomposed to the point that there are no single points of failure. We don't have one server running some sort of a general ledger. We have a whole bank, a whole farm, a whole data center, thousands or tens of thousands. In the case of the mega data centers, a Facebook or a Google kind of application, you got literally hundreds of thousands of servers running, and any number of those can go down. In the regular size enterprise, a Fortune 500, even something like SAP will be running on many, many servers. And so the urgency to fix one server is really not your primary task in life. It's optimizing the cost of the computing function. So workflows document and measure these change processes. This is one of those things that we're going to all have to warm up to, and many of the people that dive into DCIM early have realized that getting their workflow processes in order so that they're well documented, so that they're defendable, so that you can recreate them, you can transport them to other people, you can refine them over time as various steps become streamlined. That's really the big hook here. I was on stage with a panel on DCIM in Las Vegas last week, and we had a gentleman, Chuck from McKesson, and after deploying DCIM throughout his entire organization, he summed it up by saying, I thought I was jumping in on a power-saving exercise, but the reality is it was about process and workflow management that made DCIM pay for itself over and over and over again. We found that 20% of the processes can be saved when you start accurately defining process, articulating it, and documenting it. So in the course of an 8-hour day, that means an hour and a half you get back an hour and a half of each process just by having it well defined. And at a typical hourly rate, you're talking significant savings, way more than just saving a few kilowatts in power here and there. So questions that workflows answers, how are you notified of when your server arrives? where is it in its productive life cycle? How do you receive a work order? How do you know when to place a server into production? How do you get it off production? These are all things that are associated with processes. And keep in mind that a life cycle for a server can be 3 to 4, in some cases 5 years. So you have several processes to get it into production. You have remediation processes to keep it in production and configured properly over the course of 3 or 4 years. And then you have an additional set of processes to remove it from production. And that's really what workflow is all about. It's defining the steps to put it into a useful production state, keeping it there, and then removing it when it's no longer needed for the business. Let's go on to myth number 3. DCIM should auto-discover all of my assets. And this one actually comes about in a bunch of different terminologies. We all grew up on IT where you could sniff the network and find out that you have 1,000 servers or 200 servers or whatever your data center has. And we've always looked for it. There must be some analogous to finding assets on the data center floor. The reality is discovery only works with assets with IP addresses and then only at the logical level. So there is no sniffing tool on the planet that can go off and look at an industry standard data center and figure out that you have a server in the 3rd rack from the right, 4 U's up from the floor. Now, sure, there are a couple of companies that are looking at proprietary mechanisms of doing that, sort of retrofitting existing solutions, and some of them actually work fairly well. It's a retrofit scenario, and it's one of those things that you can add on to the equation. But the reality is things like data center room location, you have to deal with rack location, U slot, power connections, network connections. Much of that you really can't even do, even with these retrofit kits. I can't necessarily find how it's connected to power. Which outlet is that server? It becomes a matter of, how did I put it together? What did I design? And if I've executed my work order properly, I will know how it's connected. And I think that's really the thought process here, is that the reality is if you've done things by design rather than showing up on the data center floor with 5 servers, looking for space and then trying to find an outlet and a network port while you're there, then everything on the back end keeps track of how it's connected, why it's there, where it's located. And if we can get into this design versus reactive kind of mode, then most of these myths kind of answer themselves. So DCIM should auto-discover all my assets really would be replaced with, can my design be kept up to date so that I know, with the touch of a button, where everything is and why it's there? And the answer is yes, DCIM can do that and give you the answers to all the questions. Number 4, Matt. And this is somehow somewhat related to what we just talked about. There are a number of folks out there that think that once I've put DCIM in place, it should be able to keep track of the changes because I started the system off, I described the racks, I put things in rack locations, and I'm now going to go off and make changes with workflows. The reality is, as long as you make changes with workflows, as long as you have some sort of a way of auditing that, and as long as you have some way of keeping track of it on the back end, your changes will be reflected in your DCIM system. But again, there's no technology. The racks and the servers and the switches, they don't have any sort of mechanism to figure out what server was plugged into which rack location. So it does require processes and some technology. So RFID technology is a good one, barcode, workflows themselves, CMDBs. There's a number of mechanisms, and Enlight takes a great deal of pride in bringing all of the available mechanisms that can give you any portion of the equation and putting them together into our system. But the reality is, if you've instilled this discipline that we've talked about for the last 10 minutes or so, then the DCIM system itself will be kept up to date, and you don't have to necessarily keep sending people constantly searching every time they need to go make a change to the data center floor. Let's go off to number 5. Any DCIM vendor can integrate systems. This comes up a lot. We are creatures of urgency, we are creatures of habit, and in the IT world, we typically, when we're faced with a challenge, we sit down with Excel or some other tool and we just write it. That's what we do. If you look at the IT world, it's actually the only world that has inherited this mentality that we are technical enough that we can go off and write our own tools of the trade. The finance group does not do it. The engineering group doesn't do it. Sales doesn't do it. So, when we look at integrating systems as a vendor, we really encourage people to say, rather than taking that as a yes/no kind of answer, let's look at what your total cost would be and the value of doing that when a vendor says, yeah, sure, I can integrate systems. It's easy to do. I can give you this connector. I'll get some programmers on it, and you'll have a connection from my DCIM to your general ledger, let's say. It's really about total cost of ownership. You have to consider your business is going to change. So over time, the rules associated with those integrations are going to change, the processes, the business logic, which system you want to become the master of certain types of data. And so as that change happens, the provision for making that change has to be very, very real. It has to be built into the process. And there's a cost associated with making change to integrations. How do you leverage new capabilities? All of these systems end up with new capabilities fairly regularly. So whether it's in the general ledger or whether it's in the DCIM system, there are certain things that will come about, and you want to be able to take advantage of those. What about support? When a vendor says, now I've integrated those two systems, which you asked me to do, call me if you have any problems. That's really, call me so that we can do a new project. And we feel very strong that integration should not be an engineering project every 3 months or every 9 months for you, because there's costs associated with, there's potentially downtime associated with making integration changes. So, knowing who to call and what it's going to impact in your production, those are really important questions. Integrating systems, are also fairly delicate. Every vendor has their own API. They've got their own web interface or whatever they use, and there's well-documented access mechanisms which are fairly cumbersome to understand. How do you authenticate? How do you create a transaction? How do you close and acknowledge transactions? So there's a lot of work with understanding what's the accepted, certified way of integrating to any significant third-party application. And then lastly, how do you know when things are going wrong? How do you track it down? How do you audit the performance? How do you look for errors? All of these things typically have to be built into an integration. So, when we look at integrations and when you are looking at integrations, it's really important to ask some pretty hard questions here, because this is an application that's going to live for the better part of a dozen years. Most applications, whether it's a general ledger or a Salesforce automation tool, are put in place and stay there for at least 10 or 12 years, at least. Integrations between systems have to therefore live for that same period of time. What you want to do is make sure you've asked the questions, how is this integration going to work for the next 10 years? What's the cost going to be to me every time a new version of the software comes out, or some sort of a new feature or business rule needs to be implemented? What's it going to cost me over the period of that, that long period of 10 to 12 years? So it's not about a yes, no kind of answer. There really are very, very different answers to that question. And if you put time in there, in this case 10 years, I think you'll get an eye-opening kind of response from every vendor. Let's go off to myth number 6. This one comes up actually all the time. It's one of our favorites. 3-dimensional views are better than 2D. I think what ends up happening is that there are some tools in the market that have amazing, Hollywood-style animations and views. Every time we actually get down around the table with a customer that is potentially considering Enlight or any significant DCIM effort, what they realize is that work gets done in 2D. There are many things that 3D is really good at, is looking at rack collisions, front to back. Where's the server going to collide with something on the front rails versus the back rails? How cabling is going to be routed, that's great in 3D. You want to know, where it's going to be routed, how it's going to go under the floor, things like that. CFD modeling for computational fluid dynamics, understanding how the environment in the data center is made up over time and how it changes over the course of a day. Those are all good in 3D as far as visibility, and I would encourage you to talk to vendors about that. But what ends up happening is almost everything else is done in 2D. Trending, drill down, hotspot IDing, reporting, dashboards, really everything else when it comes to work orders or asset configurations, everything that you'd consider your job is done in 2D. It's very rare that 3D actually becomes part of what you do. And so when you look at schematics of cabling plants, or when you look at asset records, it's all in 2D. 3D is a nice to have, but I would be very cautious, looking at that as something that's essential, because it'll end up taking you down a path that is more cosmetic rather than strategic. And I think we all are sitting here on this call basically looking for, how do I get into some sort of a strategic plan that is going to answer that cost side of the equation, reducing the cost to provide the IT computing function. Let's go on to myth number 7. This actually comes up all the time. All DCIM offerings are basically the same. And this, to some degree, goes back to that comment I made in the very beginning of this call, that the category is ill-defined. It has no subcategories. So when some vendor raises their hand and says, we have a DCIM offering, you have to almost ask yourself, well, did they make radios or did they make tires? Using that automotive example I gave earlier. Each vendor has something in the broad category of DCIM. It may do the same as our solution. Our solution may be complementary, may be competitive. If you look at this diagram on the slide, what you'll realize that some are really something else. There are some companies that raise their hand and say, I've got a DCIM solution, but in fact it may be something completely different. They've just decided to align themselves with the DCIM category. Some solutions are standalone, some sort of a monitoring package that stands on its own. Some are dramatically overlapping with each other, so there are absolute competitive products out there, but they're also complementary. At Nlight, we complement companies like FieldView, RF Code. We work all the time, even though companies like those would show up in the DCIM roundups. So, you could look at a roundup and say, well, Nlight must compete with RF Code because they're both in the DCIM category. Well, the reality is they're very complementary. RF Code makes a set of location and environmental sensors, and those are perfect feeds to the Nlight system. So the bottom line here is that all DCIMs are really not the same. They've got varied capabilities, and you get what you pay for to some degree holds here, but by that I mean if you're paying a fraction of the price for one solution versus the other, it's very likely that you're going to be getting a fraction of the functionality. For instance, many DCIMs are great at visualizing rack elevations, but they do nothing for process flow or monitoring. And so consequently, they're going to be priced significantly less than something that handles business function and business alignment. So they're not all the same. You have to define your definition of DCIM that's important to you, and look for companies that are in the broad market that can compete, that can complement each other. Let's go on to the next slide, slide number 8. This also comes up, and this is just from our heritage as innovative hobbyists, frankly. Building a DCIM is easy. I can tell you, dozens and dozens of times I've sat down with prospective customers, and they said, well, you know what, we sat down a few years ago and we just decided to build this. What ends up happening is that we do have a bias as IT professionals, long-term IT professionals, we have a bias towards building, not buying. We have the tools, we understand Excel, we understand, programming, so we are accustomed to building our own tools. And frankly, and this is sort of the dirty little secret, when we do that, it tends to be our hobby rather than our job. So many times I'll see data center managers have somebody on their staff that runs crash carts or does something else, and in their spare time, they've gone off and built an Excel spreadsheet. that keeps track of their whole data center and its connectivity and devices and things of that nature. So it becomes sort of the off-the-book set of tool creation. They are the only developer, and to some degree, the tool then becomes ingrained in the operation of that data center. So our desire to be responsive and accommodate the business turns into this poorly executed, it may be a great tool, but it's a very cumbersome thing to keep going. It's very difficult, and it's frankly, it's not even someone's job. It tends to be their hobby. It's also difficult to meet the kind of capabilities that companies that have spent, in the case of Enlight, 10 years with thousands of customers telling us what they'd love to see. We've put 10 years of engineering into a product. It would be very hard to meet even a fraction of that capability by having somebody who is essentially doing it as a hobby in their regular life with Excel. We also run into the issue when you're building your own that you ignore the cost of development. Because it's a hobby, but yet it is coming out of his workday, because the support issue is really not addressed, and every time a change needs to be enacted, it has to be put on his shoulders or someone else's shoulders. There's really a total cost to the company that is hidden, but it's very real. And all of those development resources, all of those support, all of the lack of capability, because there's many things that you'd like to be able to do, whether it's reporting or dashboards, that somebody that is doing it as a hobby simply can't get to because they're too busy with other things. So there's opportunity costs, and those what you'll find start really making the case that if you're serious about taking a strategic approach to data center management, then building your own tool is likely not the right answer. And I can tell you over and over again where people have started that, they've ended up in one case in San Diego. I talked to a guy that had a 20 megabyte Excel spreadsheet, and every time I see him, he says, I just can't wait to get out of this ownership of having my own tool so that I can use a commercial tool and get back to my real business. So, as you go through this, why would you defocus from your core business, your real job? You'll never get kudos for building that tool or having the only tool that's difficult to support within your organization. It's better just to leave that to the companies that do it for a living. Let's go up to myth number 9. Price should be the primary buying criteria, and to some degree this goes with the one we just talked about. Price, value, and all costs must be assessed together. There's so many people that realize after they get deep into this that the amount of functionality each product has varies widely, and so as you decide what's important to you, you should think about what value are you trying to get from it. Are your executives trying to get a handle on how the IT function is being delivered? Do you have support resources, data center managers? What value is important to you? What scale? You've got 2 data centers, you've got 22 data centers. How big is this rollout going to be? When you look at the price of products, to some degree, it's depth and breadth. So deep features that are available across the board tend to have costs associated with them. But as you look through this, what you should almost do is turn the table and say, rather than trying to figure out what I'm going to spend and then trying to find a tool that will allow me to come under that budget, start with what you're trying to do. Figure out, what capabilities you need, what's important to you, what are your executives going to be doing at the end of the day when they look at a screen and they are trying to come up with they're trying to come up with the game plan that says, I'm going to invest a certain amount of money into this equation, and it's going to allow me to do the IT function better. And that's really what we're all trying to get at this point, right, is delivering IT at a price that you can defend and stand up in front of people and say, I'm delivering email at $22 a month per user, and that's better than going to some sort of a out-service provider. One of the little-known facts is that 37% of all IT spend last year was spent outside of IT. And that's because the IT function has become slow to deliver. with unknown costs and unknown delivery expectations. So as you go through, buying a DCIM, you shouldn't start with the price of it. You should really look at, what does it take to integrate this into other things that are already up and running in my data center? What are the hidden costs of hardware? How do I really look at what my cost is for DCIM so that I have a full picture of what it costs, but more important, I have a full picture of what it does. And we call that total cost of ownership over the lifetime, because it's many, many years, a dozen years in most cases, that you'll be living with DCIM integrated to other systems out there. So let's go to myth number, next slide. I think this might be the last slide. We also hear the myth that I'm going to private cloud and colos, and then as an auxiliary, I'm going to the cloud, so I don't need DCIM. The reality is the need for data center infrastructure management doesn't disappear. In the case of private cloud and colo, you still own the racks. You still are putting information into boxes that are sitting on data center floors. In the case of a colo, somebody else owns the concrete, but what's in the rack and how it's connected and the business function on it and the virtualization, all of that is something that's there. So in a private cloud, you still run on in-house data center infrastructure, and you own the cement. In the case of colo, it's the same thing, except someone else owns the cement. At the end of the day, those are all resources that you still need to keep track of and manage as if it's an in-house. I mentioned a moment ago that we also hear customers say, I'm going to the cloud, so I don't need DCIM. Well, they'll still be saying that they're going to the cloud 5 years from now, 8 years from now, 10 years from now. This is a slow transition to the cloud. Not all services, if you look at Gartner and 451, they'll tell you that not all services are going to migrate to the cloud. So we're in a point right now where, although cloud is very topical, it's not necessarily like you're going to go overnight and go from all in-house to all cloud and no longer have any equipment of your own. I would guess that if you're 20% in the public cloud today, you'll be 40% in the public cloud in 5 years, which still means 60% of your IT function is running on servers that you need to optimize, that you need to keep track of, and you need to manage the workflow around. So it's very, very important to think a little bit about that 60% or 80% in the case of today, here and now, and say, although strategically my company has made choices to go to things like the public cloud, I still need to manage my IT function. And along the way, I'm going to use things like private cloud and colos are hot right now. Everybody's going to them. That is just another data center for you. So your need for DCIM is even more important if you're going to the colo, because you typically don't have as much staff sitting in a colo. You have lots of equipment, you have lots of racks, but typically less staff. And it's down the street or across town or across the country in some cases. So having DCIM is critically important if you're going to the private cloud and colos. Next. So I'll leave you on the last few thoughts. There's so much information out there, and some of it seems to conflict with one another. Seek trusted and demonstrable experience. And by that I mean anytime you ask something, and if you're serious about DCIM, anytime you ask a question or hear a comment, challenge the presenter, challenge the source. Ask them to show you what they just said. If they want to show you about the integration or some sort of a workflow capability or whatever it is, say, okay, that sounds great, show it to me. I want to see it, because you'll be able to get some sense for what that really means to you by being able to sit down and touch it. Number two, find and talk to peer end users using various tools. There's enough people, enough companies, enough of your peers that have already deployed DCIM that they can give you story after story, things to look for, things to avoid. They can give you their experience basically summed up over a cup of coffee. So talk to your peers, talk to people, put notes out on the conferences online, the AvCom shows, LinkedIn. I mean, there are lots of ways of getting access to your peers, and really look for some guidance after they've gone through the same path that you're going to walk down. Talk to analysts that cover the space. Most of the analysts now have some pretty dedicated people. 451 and Gartner are great in this respect. You know, they have people out there that are, this is their whole livelihood, is to follow the DCIM industry. And so when you start looking at analysts that cover it, since they are typically unbiased and they have no axe to grind, they're just going to give you the raw information on what to expect and what they've seen and what they've heard. And then last question, which I will say again, ask the hard questions and be very, very specific. If you ask about integrations, for example, don't just say, can you integrate? Ask, how will you integrate? Tell me the story about integration between System A and System B, and give me all the detail. And then give me a customer that's done it. I want to talk to someone that's using that integration. And then let's talk about the price. And let's talk about every little detail. And so ask the hard questions, you know, visualization, show me what I'm going to be able to do, show me my dashboards. My executive team wants to see a dashboard that shows remaining capacity in my data center. Show me that report. Show me that dashboard. These are the kind of things that I would expect as you're going through this DCIM journey to be able to clarify. Any vendor that's worth their salt should be able to address any of these hard questions with ease. So with that, I think I'm out of time. Any questions? Or Matt, you're going to pick it back up again?
Yeah. So, well, first, thanks, Mark. I always learn listening to you presenting this, topics such as this. I will say very quickly that absolutely this presentation will be distributed as well as with the recording. So we encourage you to have coworkers or colleagues just register and they can get the recording. We will automatically send it out. I have a few kind of hybrid comments and observations, if you don't mind taking a couple, Mark. Sure. One of them is almost more of a clarification on the automotive analogy. So I think the analogy that you were making was about, say, people that were affiliating in with DCIM, whereas maybe they only offer one aspect of DCIM. And I think the analogy you made was, well, I make automotive radios versus I make automotive tires, therefore I'm an automotive company, and that's not exactly true. But I wanted to have you talk a little bit about people saying, well, I make tires, and I also offer tires, but not all tires are the same. Could you draw that analogy a little bit into DCIM?
Yeah, DCIM, you know, when we kind of put the category together, almost 10 years at this point, we kind of looked at what are the bounds of what DCIM will entail. And the general consensus was it was going to give IT more of a view of facilities, and it was going to give facilities more of a view of IT. So I would say that's probably the only premise that I could say universally has been agreed on what DCIM is. I can tell you what it's not. It's not a building management system. So there are a couple of hard and fast things that have been either included or excluded from the definition of DCIM. Everything else in the middle there is part of the DCIM journey. So, you know, I use the example of the RFID technologies that allow you to locate assets or report temperature. That is a DCIM participant. However, that is considered a portion of the DCIM value. Companies like Enlight deliver things like workflow and visualization, reporting, asset management, ITSM connection. You know, those are also portions of the IT journey. I think when you look at, you know, how you are competing or complementing other vendors, I think that should be a very straightforward discussion. And I think where people that are on the phone might get confused is where you have every vendor that appears to say that they do everything. And I can tell you over and over again where we've seen RFPs come out from very, very large Fortune 50 companies. You know, months and months are spent writing RFPs, and you know, for whatever reason, those RFPs are so comprehensive that all dozen of the responses that they get back, the vendors have said, yes, we can do it all. And so in those cases, those RFPs typically get shelved, and then the project gets postponed for another 6 months so they can try to figure out what did we do wrong when we wrote the RFP, how did we not ask the questions that were more specific and more definitive? So, when you look at the DCIM category, my recommendation is always almost ignore the word DCIM. If you're looking for tires, tell people you're looking for tires. If you want to get a radio for your car, tell them you're looking for a radio. I would rather get, write an RFP that talked about tires and the performance of them and how long they lasted and what color they were and how round they were. I would love to get an RFP that says that if I made tires, because if I'm a radio builder, I won't even respond to that, and everybody's life is easier. So be very specific. I would say try to avoid the use of DCIM as a defining term, since it doesn't have any segmentation within it today.
And to avoid, just say, do you have workflow?
Yeah.
Whereas workflow is you need to be very specific on it. Just like
correct.
You wouldn't want just any tire on your whatever sports car. You'd want all season, steel belted, run flat, whatever.
Bingo.
So not all tires are the same, not all workflows are the same, not all capacity plannings are the same. I think that was the point that the commenter was making. So great. Okay, response to this. We have a myth or fact request from the audience. A real DCIM cannot be deployed as an off-site SaaS solution. You would need hardware on-site. Myth or reality?
Myth. I think there's, the wave of software as a service, cloud-based offerings has really not overlooked DCIM. DCIM can be a well-behaved application that sits in the cloud. Even things like data collection can be virtual appliances that are running, inside a firewall, so to speak, and report. So, I know of a number of products, our own included. I know of a number of products that are delivered as a service. No hardware is required. Things like monitoring are done in virtual appliances that sit inside a firewall, and those are happily up and running. So, there is some myth that, and this comes back from years ago where monitoring tended to be done in some sort of a dedicated server, but as dedicated servers essentially became virtualized, so did things like data collection, monitoring, polling engines. All of those are typically done in software engines today, which live inside a firewall, and then in most cases of cloud DCIM offerings, they feed up to some sort of a cloud instance where users then have access to it. So yeah, there's no limitations on a DCIM offering, no requirement for hardware inside your data center.
Yeah, great response. I guess kind of the capstone and final question would be along what is the source of a lot of these myths. To meet, my response is it seems to come from some of the customers themselves. So I know customers and prospects have come to Nlight saying, hey, yeah, we could build this solution, and they come back to us 2 years ago. I think that was one of the root causes of make or buy, that software companies have said that they would do it, and then they never did it because they never, they couldn't organize. But I also think, is it not true that a lot of the myths come from vendors themselves? So a vendor has a huge capability. They're very good at communicating to the market. And so is that, and I think that's probably why you said go to trusted sources, go to people that have deployed, go to analysts, because, hey, don't take the vendor's word for it. So do vendors seem to be the main source, or what is the main source of myths?
There's actually two sources. Yeah, there's a good question, Matt, or whoever sent it in. There's actually two sources. One is vendors themselves that have some sort of a technology they're trying to promote. And so the myth is, you just asked something about, is hardware required to do this? Well, the answer is no. I'm guessing that part of that myth comes from a vendor that makes hardware that does it. But the second source is typically for executive management that may not be close enough to the trees to really be able to understand what DCIM is, but they know 15 years ago or 20 years ago when they were, a data center technician of some or equivalent, that they would have done things differently. And so their expectations could be based on 10 or 15-year-old, 20-year-old experience that they had. So some of these challenges or detail which is presented as fact, which in fact is fiction, just comes from the ways things would have worked 15, 20 years ago, when some of the executives now were just cutting their teeth on IT. So I would say it comes from both sources. People that the technology changed, but 20 years ago you would have done it a different way, and then obviously vendors themselves that have taken a certain approach present fact as if fiction as if it's fact.
Got it. Makes perfect sense given the background. Okay, well I think with that we'll close the webinar. Again, thank you so much, Mark. Again, I always learn a lot. Thank you to everyone that stayed with us and submitted questions. We absolutely appreciate it. Feel free to continue to send questions or even requests for webinar topics. We will be sending out within 24 hours the recording of the materials and a PDF of the slides themselves. So with that, thank you everyone. Have a great day.